Hi everyone, good morning, good evening, good night, good afternoon, good whatever. So today we're going to start editing one of 5 images in a minute, just after I've covered a couple of new things and some new news. For those that aren't aware, we're going to be editing in Capture One Pro. That's the piece of software that I use for my images. It's now growing in popularity. And I'm going to talk about one of the ways that you can get your hands on this pretty soon. So, first off, let's go into the version of Capture One Pro that you should be running if you want to be following along with any of these. And that is now version 20.0.4. So if you download the latest version of Capture One from their website, that's the version that will come down. Last month they had some offers on. The offers were in part down to the fact that we've got an awful lot of editing time on our hands as a world at the moment. Those offers have actually been extended in some different way into April, which is good news for everyone that doesn't already have Capture One. There's some even better news in a minute that you'll see. So for those people that want the Pro version, that covers all camera models, not just the Sony or the Fuji versions, which are limited to those manufacturers. This means that you can open a file, a raw file that was edited or captured in any of the cameras that are out there commercially. There's a 25% discount that applies to all purchases until the end of April, according to Capture One. And also because some people were feeling left out, I think, the people that already had the version of Capture One prior to version 20, which for lots of different reasons was called version 12. There is a 30% discount off of anyone wanting to upgrade. So that again applies until the end of April. That's 30% off. You just need to use the code upgrade30 at checkout. And then you'll get your version upgraded to the latest, which is 20.0.4. To people that already have 20, make sure you've updated. Okay. For people that don't want to spend any money right now, we have an alternative, which is a funky cool competition. So the guys at Capture One have been running a program called the 30-Day Challenge. This is about getting you proficient with Capture One through tiny little tips and tricks over the next 30 days. So if you go to our site, so paulreefer.com/edit-with-us, you'll find all the details in there. There is a very simple competition. You have to answer a very simple question, which the answer is freely available on the internet if you know where to look. And there might even be a link on that page to tell you where to look. So if you answer that question on that page, so paulreefer.com/edit-with-us, all one word, you will be in with a chance of winning the license, the full Pro license, the perpetual one, so the one that you own rather than subscribe, and you can get started and follow along. For those that don't want to do either of those things and just want to have a play, then don't forget that you can always go on to captureone.com and get hold of a free trial that's completely functional for 30 days. In that period of time, you can work out whether you want to get one or whether you have won that competition. So I'll cover that at the end as well for those people that missed it. Hi everyone, so Darren, afternoon. Mark upgraded this morning using the code, cool. Let's go into Capture One, and one of the images that we are going to return to in today's session is one of Mark's, so that's quite funky. Let's get started with Daniel's. So we've got a cool little abstracty image here. So this is one where we're going to play with a couple of things here, a couple of the basic tools and also some of the color correction. I know what this scene is trying to do, and I get it. It's just the way that it's cropped, the way that it's looking up, the camera angle is a little bit skewed. The way it's looking up, it's not quite a finished print, is what I'd call it. It's still at snapshot stage at this point. We've just got to do a bit of tweaking just to get it perfectly right. So the first tweak is, this is obviously taken in sort of sunset or sunrise hours. I'm guessing from the number of people, it's probably sunset, because you don't tend to see that many people out at sunrise. So we've got a nice glow, we've got a nice warm glow here, but it's not really warm enough for my liking. It doesn't scream sunset, it's a little bit flat as an image. We can see, so a good lens, good camera, taking at f9, I might tick diffraction correction just because we've got some really, really high contrasty bits in the edges here, although it's in bokeh, not too worried about it. I'm not worried about light fall off because we're actually going to do some vignetting on this shot anyway. Good morning, David and Bruce. You're both in the US. Cool. Hope you guys are all safe and sound over there at the moment. So let's go into our color correction. So First thing is let's warm it up. So we've got our white balance, which was as shot. So one thing to remember, whenever you pull in a raw image into Capture One, the default mode that the white balance is going to select is shot, and that's whatever the camera recorded. So it's not going to tell you if your camera was on auto mode or not. What it is going to tell you is that this is what your camera was told to capture as the white balance. If you had it on auto mode, that would have been auto. If you dialed it in manually, these would be the same as your manual settings. So I'm going to guess most people have their camera set to auto, so this is probably on auto mode. I'm just going to warm things up a bit. So this Kelvin value here, we talked about cities being, between 2,500 and 3,500 Kelvin at night. For a sunset or a sunrise, typically it's up into the sort of 7,000 to 8,000 for those really, really warm tones. Now, when we do that, we've also got some of this green up here in the sky. So it is blue, obviously, but it just gets a little bit of a tint of green as we start pulling that Kelvin up. So we're going to correct for that with our tint, which we know goes from a slider of green through to pink. So I'm going to take that away from where it was, which is down here, and pull it up just there. We might even go a little bit more. Now with this, so this has changed the color temperature. What it hasn't changed is the amount of color. So by that, what I mean is we can have an image which has only got 10% of color in it. It could be pretty much a black and white image. And changing the color temperature will change the temperature of the color that's there. But it's not going to change the amount of color that's there. And in this shot, I want a bit more punch in the color. So let's go to our exposure tab up here on the left, on top left. And we're going to use our saturation slider. Now, I would normally steer away from saturation. The reason is because you can do a lot of damage, and it's not permanent damage. Obviously, we're in an editing program, but without control and without going a bit careful, you can make images look so oversaturated that they just feel awful to look at. They feel uncomfortable to your eyes. So this slider, just be really careful with it. A little goes a long way on this one, and on here, I'm talking about sort of maybe 8 or 9 in terms of where we're at on that scale. We don't need to worry too much about highlights and shadow recovery in this shot, because actually if we look at our histogram here, it's pretty balanced. We don't have anything that's screaming overexposed too much. I'm guessing this light here might be. Let's turn on our exposure warning just to see. Oh, that one's not too much. But these lights were. So I could pull in our whites a little bit just to stop those from being overexposed, and our highlights a bit. So do a little bit of HDR recovery. So we've got nothing that's overexposed now in those lights. A little bit here, we might have some specular highlights and stuff. I'm not too worried about those. It's reflecting from the glass. That sort of makes sense. But by doing that, we have lost a little bit of our glow up in the top of the sky. So we're going to fix that in a second. I could pull up our shadows a touch to about there. That looks nice. Okay, now we're going to do a little bit of format correction. So the string here sort of works. This one here being chopped off on the right hand side, I've sort of got to make a decision. Do we lose it or do we leave it in? I'm tempted to lose it. Let's go on to our Keystone tool. So we covered that the other day. Keystone allows us, rather than just changing our horizon level, so that's just the straighten tool, which does a good job, but we've still got this lean here on the wheel, which isn't quite right. So what I'm going to do is use our Keystone tool, and I'm going to tell Capture One that this is the sea. It should be straight, it should be flat. This is the horizon. And what I'm doing, even though I'm moving this left-hand side, what I'm actually doing is looking at this area here and this virtual line it's drawing and making sure that my virtual line sits on the horizon, because I can't see the horizon on the left, but I can see that line. So I can use that line to make sure that I've got this straight. So this was actually quite a way out if I look at that as a straight line against the horizon compared to the actual shot. Now we've got a building here which we can use as our vertical line. That's great. I'm going to keep the vertical, or the top part of the Keystone level at the top. And let's use these lights here as a guide to what's straight. So it's about there. And I'm going to assume that these cables typically would hang completely vertically. There might be a little bit of a kink in there, but they're generally going to be vertical in terms of their orientation. So let's go alongside one of those cables, about there, pull that up there, and hit apply. Okay, not enough yet. I actually need to pull this across, so it might be that those cables weren't quite vertical. That's a bit better there. So this is what I was saying the other day about with the Keystone Tool, people can get very, very lost with it very quickly because it gets out of hand. Tiny, tiny little corrections make things correct. Big changes really, really make things a bit scary. So with that done, let's now look at our crop, because I've either got to keep some of this bulb in or not. I might do a little bit of a heel in a minute, so let's just do that there. Got to decide whether we want a load of people in this shot or not. Let's go to that. Not quite happy with that. Let's, I'm just going to make our keystone correction a little bit off, just intentionally, because this is one where I'm going to have to compromise whether it's completely straight versus not losing all of the people at the bottom. So let's go for that. There we go. Okay, so I've sacrificed the fact that it's not exactly level, but this is helping me here because it's hiding the horizon a little bit. And I've got this little bit of light bulb here. I kind of want to lose that light bulb. So let's try our healing tool. I'm going to create a new layer. So hold down on the plus key because I don't just want an empty standard layer. What I want is a heal layer. Great. So we're going to choose with our brush where our source is going to be. Let me just turn off that exposure warning. Okay. So source is going to be here, and I hold down the option key and click to choose the source. And our destination is going to be here. And I'm going to paint. And we're going to paint. Ignore the preview stuff that comes up. It can be a bit messy. There we go. One light bulb gone. Cool. There's a little bit left up there. So let's just use our brush again on that same healing brush. It's probably just the part of the cable. Yep, that's gone. Nice. So now I've got a much cleaner image. Background's still there. This is the bulb that's in focus. The one to the left isn't so much. So let's use that as a focal point. Let's and instead of, again, let's go into the standard tool, vignetting. So if, let's go back to our background layer, not the healing layer. If I were to vignette the whole image, we're bringing the focus to the wheel. We're not bringing the focus to this light bulb. So this central vignetting really doesn't help us. And what's come in recent versions of Capture One is obviously the Radial Filter. So let's click on Radial here on a new layer. I'm going to call this one Light Bulb. And with our Radial Filter, I'm going to use a vignette, but I'm not going to use it around the center of the image. I'm going to use it around the center of this light bulb. Now, we've got to be careful when you're doing things like this because obviously the light bulb isn't on. It doesn't make sense that light is coming from the light bulb. I need this to be subtle, but I want the focus to be on that bulb and not everywhere else. So if I turn the mask on, you can see what effect that's had. By changing this inner circle, we change, remember, the gradient here between a harsh gradient, fall off, so this falls off very quickly from 100% to 50 to 0. If I pull it into the center, that fall off still happens, 0, 50, 100, but it happens over a lot bigger area, so you don't notice it so much. It's a bit more subtle. So with this, now on this light bulb layer, we can go up to our exposure and we can darken. Now I'm going to go over the top here. I'm going to darken the overall exposure around this radial. And then I'm going to pull up the exposure on our background layer. And this then becomes a balancing act because I've got one layer that's going to darken an area around it and one layer that's going to affect the whole picture. So let's get to about there. That looks pretty good, maybe a bit too much. There, and then we've got to reduce this difference here. So this is only a 0.8 of a stop difference between here and the outside, but it's added a lot more focus onto the bulb. We're just gonna spin this around so we've got more of a shape of a bulb on that radial. You'll see what I mean here. So it's more of a vertical circle than or oval than a horizontal one. Okay. Let's turn that off. So we've now got our focus point here, there. Now with our background, we can afford to push that saturation up a little bit more. We can make it a little bit warmer again. There, we can add a bit more tint into there. That's not bad. Let's pull our light bulb. I don't want it too much of a difference there again. Okay, so let's create a clone and reset. So there was our shot out of the camera. And there's our warmed version for sunset. So the difference, again, let's just recap them. So we changed the white balance, we changed the keystone, we changed the level of the horizon, and we've added some focus onto this light here simply by adding one of these radial masks, which goes from this darker area at the top, all around here in the red and the solid mask, through to the lighter area down here in the bulb. And if we don't like that gradient, or we want it more, well, of course, all you can do is change your exposure amount. It's probably a bit too much. We can even lighten the area around the outside, but this is probably about the right amount to keep it looking real. So there's our original, there's our final. Not bad. Okay, let's switch people around. So I said we're going to come to Mark. Let's go to Mark, a lighthouse shot in Iceland. So what we have got in this shot is some nice cool clouds. We've got a lot of different tones, a lot of different textures and so on. We've got a lot of texture in this rock down here. We've got some nice sharp details in there. We've got this leading line here. So compositionally, really nice. The sun, if only the sun was a little bit there, but that's down to the time of year. We can't move the sun, unfortunately. So let's have a look at what we can do with it. First off, let's just think about what I'm likely to do. The first thing is I'm going to probably want to enhance the sky a little bit, just bring out some of the details a bit more. The next thing is probably bring out some of this rock detail. So let's just, to prove the point, let's pull up this rock here. Let's zoom into, we're at 200%. So in here, we've got all this rock, but let's see what was actually there. Look at all this detail that we actually did capture in the camera. But obviously, because we're exposing, and it's a difficult exposure, so this was done with a filter, but you've still got this bright area here with the sun, because you're shooting into the sun. You've got effectively the lighthouse in silhouette almost, because it's away from the sun. Luckily, we've got enough residual light around to illuminate it. And then these bits are obviously going to be in shadow. So we're going to balance some of that up. I'm also going to change some of the white balance a little bit, just to warm up that sun. What we're not going to try and do is fix the fact that the sun is overexposed, because we can't. So let's pull our exposure all the way down. So this was shot with a manufacturer profile. So it's probably Sony A7R2. Okay, decent amount of dynamic range in the Sony. Just like we did last session, we're going to analyze the chromatic aberration in this exact shot. So we get a profile specifically for this shot. The Capture One has actually worked out what it needs to do. And let's pull down our exposure just to see what we could get away with if we really wanted to. So do you remember the other day when we were doing a session on, I think it was the Swiss Alps somewhere, and I said there comes a point, if you have the exposure warning on and you pull down the exposure tab and it starts going bright white before all the red has disappeared, that's telling you there is no data in this. So what we've done effectively is we've pulled the exposure tab down to the point where Capture One thinks that there is nothing more to do because it can't pull any more data out of that area, but clearly it's still bright white. If I pull the exposure all the way down, so that's the whole image dark as we can get, so it's 4 stops under, this is still blown out, there's still no detail in there. So the worst thing we can do in this scenario is try and recover something where there isn't any detail. If I pull down the highlights and pull down the whites, you're still going to have this white blob here, but you're going to start to look cartoony in the rest of the image. So there comes a point, if you are shooting into the sun, it is perfectly okay, and it's perfectly normal that you might find an area that's overblown. You could bracket, you could take one shot for the sun flare and one shot for the rest of it, but if you haven't, and you've got a single shot, leave it as a sun flare, leave it as the blown out part. There's no point in trying to rescue something that's just not there. There's no data there to pull back. Okay, let's get started. So first off, let's use our straighten tool and just check that our horizon is perfectly level. Almost, not quite, but it's pretty good. So now that's done. Let's hit our hand and then we're sorted. So this is nice and level. Are these in the middle? Let's have a look, because we've got to make a decision. So I'm going to, let's just add a vertical guide in the middle. So I'll add it in the middle. So we're not quite in the center, but I don't really want to move it because I'm going to lose some more of the sun. This might be one where we have to play around digitally later on and manipulate it. But what I don't want to do is shift the image to the left for this to be in the center, because I'm going to lose what little sun we have in that pinwheel. So we'll leave that for now. If we had a little bit of, oops, wrong one. If we had a little bit of movement and we had a little bit of spare space on the left-hand side, obviously we could shift the crop along to the right. But for this purpose, we'll leave it as it is. So, just like we had a graduated filter in front of the camera on this one, we're going to add a virtual graduated filter in Capture One. So let's draw a really smooth gradient down to here. And that shows us this mask here. I'm going to pull that down there. Great. And with this filter, with this gradient filter, I'm going to add a load of clarity onto there. So if you look at the sky, if I turn this off and turn it on, do that again so you can see. So what clarity has done is, remember, clarity is a mid-tone adjustment. So it's not looking at the bright lights, it's not looking at the dark shadows. What it's doing is it's looking at all those grey areas in the middle. So the bits between, sort of on a 255 scale, the bits that are between about 80 and somewhere around 160, 170 or so. So that middle chunk of the histogram, this bit here, which is where a lot of this stuff sits. And it forces it to either go brighter or darker depending on whether what you're next to in terms of your next pixel. What the effect is that it gives that impression of punching detail and punching some of the bits in the cloud and the structure and so on in the sky without over sharpening. And that's one of the beautiful things about clarity. You don't get that over sharpening effect. But what that has done is made our sky punch a little bit more. Cool. Let's pull down our exposure just a bit. Now the problem here, you see, even though I've got this at an angle, this part here is a lot darker than this part here, obviously, because it's further away from the light source of the sun. So I don't want to do that too much there. I might even, I'm going to have a clarity layer and we're going to create a sky exposure layer. And I'm going to have a different gradient. So remember, I can have more than one gradient on an image. So on this one, I'm going to go there, maybe not quite so severe there. And this is the one that we're going to do our exposure with. And that will even up this sky. So we've got the same amount of exposure here as what we had there. Overall, with the picture, let's go back to our background layer. And I am going to rescue some of these shadows. So I'm going to pull the shadows up. That's a bit better, so we can see some of these rocks a little bit more. And pull the black slider up, so this is only affecting the bottom 10% of the histogram, not the rest of the image. I don't want to go too much, so again, let's just show you the worst case scenario. If we were to do that, we end up with one of these horrible HDR, early Instagram sort of setups. Please don't do that, it's horrible. Let's go back to where we were. So we've pulled up our shadows a little bit here. Let's just reset that black slider. So it's all about being subtle. It's about pulling out detail without making something look completely fake. So shadows up there, highlights I am going to pull down a touch because we can afford to get rid of some of this pinwheel here, and whites down a little bit there. Okay, remember I've only done clarity on this layer here, which is this part. We haven't done any clarity on the rocks, and actually I don't really want to, because even though I want to be able to see all the structure, we've done that through bringing up the shadows. If I pull too much clarity in the rocks, these start to stand out a bit too much. So we're not going to use any clarity on the base layer here. Focal point, again though, should be the lighthouse. So actually a vignette in this one would sort of work, but I don't want, again, a standard vignette, because if I do that, I'm going to end up with this very, very wide vignette here, which doesn't really make sense. I want the focus to be this way, this tall area here. Could do it with a mask. I could actually paint the mask on. But let's see if we can get away with it with just a vertical vignette. So, new layer, vertical vignette. I'm going to create a new radial mask, just like we have done before. I'm going to start from here, pull up that gradient there. I'm going to soften it all the way down to the middle, so this feather is really, really soft. And I'm going to move that to be about there. Okay. In fact, let's go. Let's go to there. Okay, I'm going to show you something else in a second. Okay, that's my mask. With this mask, let's just pull down our exposure a bit. Cool. Now, I've still got a luma range that I can apply. So remember this luma range stuff. I can say I only want to affect the red area on the light parts of the image and not the dark parts. So I don't want to make these rocks any darker. That doesn't make sense. And the problem with the vignette is, let's just turn this off. As I'm vignetting, so I'm pulling down this exposure, I'm pulling down this area here, I'm bringing focus to here, but I'm also darkening the bits that I've just spent time bringing the shadows up to. So that doesn't make sense. Instead, what we can do, so let's leave this exposure down to the extreme so you can see the difference. On our Luma range, I can say, right, yes to all the highlights, but I don't want to affect any of the parts that are already in shadow. And we're going to have a nice soft fall off so you don't notice any lines. So that fall off, if you look up here in the sky, because of course some of the sky is quite dark as well, if I have a sharp fall off, we get this horrible line of the mask. So if I make a change to the exposure, you're going to see that line. So we use this bottom part of this slider to fall it off gradually into all the way to the darkest parts. Okay, if I apply that, now we haven't affected these rocks. I'm going to undo the amount of exposure we've done, but we haven't affected these rocks. We have affected the areas up here in the sky. We brought a bit more detail or a bit more focus back to the lighthouse. We're not going to do it to that level. That's ridiculous. Let's pull it down, maybe only even a third of a stop. That's just enough. On our background, I do want to make a little change around the white balance. So I kind of want it a little bit warmer. It was sunset. So let's just pull it to there, and I'm adjusting the tint as well in time to give it a little bit of pink and a little bit of yellow, getting that color back towards what was there. And then finally, although we possibly could have done this first, let's fix all of these little errors in the image. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new heel layer, because these aren't dust spots. Choose our brush, make our brush the right size. And let's just do that one there. So these bits here, I talked about this the other day about lens flares and pinwheels and reflections of sunlight. These bits are quite normal. You can decide whether or not you want to leave these in. Some people love them, some people hate them, completely up to you. But the things like where you've got a clear refraction or reflection or refraction of the sunlight, oops, let me just undo that, we really don't want to do. We don't want that one in here. Let me just show you what it was. It's just off-putting. So let's just put a heel layer in. We can get rid of that pretty quickly. What happened there was I changed the vector of the healing layer by accident. I didn't want to do that. So let's find another. I don't know whether these were birds or bits of dust on Mark's lens. Probably bits of dust, but we'll see. There's another one up here. So let's go back to our heel layer brush. Paint that in. Some of these we could do with a dust spot tool, but actually once you get into a routine of having a heel layer that's set up correctly, you can find actually a lot of this stuff is quicker using the healing brush than it is using the dust spot tool. There, I think we're pretty good. Oh, there's one there. Okay. Cool. So again, let's go back to our original. So there's our original. Nothing wrong with the shot. Compositionally, it's great. It's pretty much level. It's exposed as best we can get with that one filter on the lens. This one just feels to be a bit more dramatic. What we could do now with our overall image is just pull up our exposure a touch. In fact, we use the brightness slider, which tends to, so that doesn't move the entire histogram across, crushing the highlights. It just brings up the middle part of it a bit more subtly to there. I'm also going to add a bit of contrast into the image there. Cool, that one looks quite nice. Let's move on to a different shot. Let's pull up a wildlife one. So very rarely do we play with wildlife ones. Tend to focus on things with nothing in them rather than animals or something moving. So let's have a look at this one. Compositionally, we're dead center in the frame. I found this quite a lot with wildlife shots. In fact, I did a bit of a play around with some wildlife shooting before. And in fact, before we go on to this one, are there any questions on the previous two edits, just in case we've missed anything? So that one and that one in terms of what we did or why we did it. Mark says thanks, so that's good. I haven't peed him off too much by editing his photo. Bruce, okay, cool. Okay, if there are questions as we're going along, just whack them into the comments thing and we'll play with them at the time. Okay, so wildlife. When you're shooting things that are moving very, very fast, lots of cameras have got very, very fancy autofocus systems nowadays. Some cameras don't have quite so fancy autofocus systems. And some people still prefer to use just frankly the middle crosshair autofocus point on a camera, knowing that with the megapixels we've got in most cameras nowadays, we can crop. So compositionally, you know, there's a choice to make. You can either make something dead central and absolutely the portrait of that object or that thing or that animal or that person. The other is that we use the sort of third rule, and we try and bring focus up to that person or animal using that sort of golden ratio. So on this one, at the moment, they're dead center. Obviously, we've got the context of they're in a tree. We've got the context of we're hiding somewhere in a bush or behind a bush or something like that. My gut feel with this shot immediately is to pull down from this left-hand side, because as I stand away from the screen, these aren't they are a focus, but they're not the only focus. I'm seeing this here because this is a very high contrast area up here with these branches, and I don't need them for context of the shot. So if I were to pull this down here, in fact I can go quite a way in there, what I'm doing is I'm keeping the inference that we're hiding by using these out of focus bushes here. And let's then pull the audience's view up to these lines here. And it just feels a more natural crop in my head. There's nothing wrong with the first crop. Let's just reset that. There's nothing wrong with this shot. And actually, I've done it myself where I've known as long as I keep the animal in the middle of the frame, it's going to be tack sharp. The camera's going to do wonders. When you start relying on 61 autofocus points or 2,500 autofocus points, sometimes it can get it wrong. It can pick up on a tree instead of an animal. So, but as a print, if I were going to have one on a wall, this one doesn't pull my eye as much as this one does, and this one just feels a bit stronger, a bit more powerful as a print. In fact, we could even afford to come down a touch more. There. This ratio here is fixed at the moment because I've set this up here to say original. So keep the original crop ratio. Don't change from 2:3, which is what it is at the moment. If I wanted it unconstrained, I could, or I could hold down one of the modifier keys on the keyboard while I'm doing stuff. So if I set it back to unconstrained, if I hold down the shift key, it's going to keep me constrained. If I let go of the shift key, I can choose whatever crop I want. Choosing whatever crop you want is a wonderful way of choosing a perfect position on your picture until you go to print it and until you go to frame it with a standard frame. If you're printing and you're framing in non-standard ways, there's no problem in doing a crop in whatever format you want. You could have this crop if you wanted to. But the second you go and try and frame the thing, you're going to be into a different world of framing options, and it's going to be expensive. So you are much better off, ideally, sticking to some of the standard sizes, which are either 4:3, 3:2, 2:1, and there's a couple of others. But try if you can to stick to the standard crops, unless you really have to. Okay, so that to me just feels, and it feels closer. If I look at this, I feel distant to the animals. Here, I feel closer. I'm in their territory. So with this, again, it's the same old tricks, actually. We're going to use some lighting to pull the focus down here. Rather than a radial filter, which is a bit rough, what I'm actually going to do is paint into these out of focus areas here with a mask. From a white balance point of view, it's not bad actually at the moment. We're on A7R3, nice lens, cool. Let's go into our white balance and let's see what it can do automatically. So again, we talked about this the other day. There are some challenges with picking up something that's completely grey in the natural world. That sort of is correct, but we've lost some of the sun glow. We know that these aren't, or the animals aren't grey, so let's not do that. That looks about right. But actually, what I'm doing is I'm fiddling around the edges. The one that was shot was perfectly fine in the first place. The reason I've just done that is because I've seen this happen before. People seem convinced they've got to fix the white balance. Sometimes the camera gets it perfectly right in the first place. Let's go back to that shot that we had here. There's nothing wrong with this white balance. It's just I want the picture to feel more like sunset. I wanted it more. I wanted it more golden. I wanted it more pink. I didn't want this sort of greeny sky here and a little bit washed out here. Doesn't mean the camera got it wrong, it's just I'm trying to enhance it a little bit to make it feel more like a mood. In this shot here of Ian's, we don't need to change it. There's nothing wrong with this mood. There's nothing. David's just said, could you crop this even more to make the image more dramatic? Yeah, we could. So I'm going to edit like this, and I'll show you another tip in a second. I'm going to edit like this, and then we'll do some more crops as well. So one little tip here. A lot of people actually edit the full image first. There are some tools that causes a problem with, because if, for instance, I do a vignette, you see this thing here, method, elliptic on crop, or circular. The vignette will change based on my crop, because it's using the crop as the reference point. So as I start cropping in smaller, the vignette will actually change which areas are vignetted and not. There's a couple of tools that if you use them and then you change the crop afterwards, it will affect the result. So some people will always edit on the wide lens or wide image just in case. And here's a perfect example actually. Imagine National Geographic phoned up after we've done this crop and said, hey, great, but we need a portrait version. Now I've got to go back to this one. So yeah, of course I could do a portrait version. I could, let's just crop it portrait. There, great. But if all of my edits have discounted this bit on the left and discounted the bit on the right, I've got to redo all my edits. So there is an argument to always editing the wider image. My personal approach to it is, instead of doing that, what I'll do is I'll edit the widest crop that I'm probably going to use. And then we'd go in tighter from there. So this is the widest that I'd probably go. I don't think I'd want to keep all of this stuff in the shot regardless. So I'm going to leave it at this crop, and then we'll come back in and crop some more later on. Because we might do that, we are not going to use the vignette tool, because if we do, we've learned that tool is going to change based on the crop that I select later. So our white balance is good. Let's have a look at, have we got any exposure warnings? A couple on the skin, not too bad. And we know the Sony's got some great dynamic range in there. So let's just pull down our, so we're not going to pull down the exposure because we've got a lovely histogram here. What we are going to do is use our high dynamic range tool. We'll pull down the whites a little bit and pull down the highlights a bit. Quite a way actually, yeah, there. I'm going to pull down the exposure a tiny bit. Sandra, this is so cool. So let's turn the exposure warning off because I want to get rid of those red warnings. Let's look at before and after with that tool. So before, again, nothing wrong necessarily. It's just we've lost some of the detail in the fur on the animals. Without our HDR tool in, we've got all of this fur back, all of this detail here. And we can also see we could probably play with a little bit of clarity on there as well, just to make it punch. But if we look at that detail there compared to without the change, at print, you're going to really notice this. So when you print that on a wall, that's going to really stand out. Whereas without it, it's going to look a bit washed. Okay, so we've got all that detail in there. What's really cool is the eyes looking straight at us. Okay, so let's bring the focus to these guys. First thing is we're going to create a new empty mask, and I'm going to call it Foreground. With our Foreground Mask, so I could cheat, there's a quick way of doing this, which is we just use a Radial Mask. Let's see what that mask's doing there. Okay, and then we can go bang. Okay, but I don't particularly want this mask in this particular case, because what it's done, yes, it's pulled down some of the foreground stuff in the out of focus areas, but it's also pulled down this tree branch, and it's also pulled down some of the mid-focused areas here, and that doesn't really make sense. So let's undo our mask, and instead we're going to use the paintbrush. Is this from Joe's Optic? Not quite, Mr. Grover, not quite. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some texturing of light. So again, I personally, so for example, I know that David Grover is online right now. Mr. Grover loves using flow to control the brush and opacity set to 100. I'm the opposite, so I use opacity rather than flow. Personal preference in terms of the way that you prefer the brush to behave. But in this case, I'm going to use 20% opacity and 100% flow. What that means is, as I'm painting a very, very, very shallow amount of the mask, only 20% of the pen. Up here, and into here. And then I'm going to enhance some of those areas just to get some texture. So again, it's literally like painting. We're just adding some texture into certain areas without affecting the whole image. I'm going to go over there a bit more. There, there, there. So let's look at our grayscale mask. So you can see what a mess I've just created. So you can see where there are areas which are not masked at all. Those are black. The areas where there's only 20%, where there's now effectively 40%, where there's almost 60%, where there's brighter. So that's my mask. To see the mask in red, you just press M, M off, M on, M off, M on. If you want to see the grayscale mask, which will remove the picture so it takes all the distraction away and you can just see your mask, hold down your Option key and press M. And that brings up your grayscale mask of what you just painted on this layer. If you press the Option key and M and nothing happens, you're probably on your background layer. So it only shows when you're on a layer with a mask. So that's our mask drawn. With those drawn lines, we're going to pull our exposure down. So just like we were going to do with the vignette, but now I can do it much more targeted just in this area here. What I'm seeing is this area is now too dark. This area I want a little bit darker, so I'm going to paint some more mask up here, just a bit. Paint a bit more down there. And in here, we're going to use our eraser. So set your eraser to the same opacity that you were drawing with, which was 20. You can decide how big you want it. And then in here, I'm just going to lighten this area up here because I did this too much on that mask. Again, let's just look at our mask. So I've undone this area here because it was already dark to start with. A bit down there as well. Okay. So if I turn this mask off and turn it on again, you can see why we've done that. Now, that's a bit heavy, even with those adjustments made. So remember, with every single layer that we create in Capture One, I've got this opacity slider up here for the whole layer. So everything I've just done, I can choose to do at 100%, or I can pull it down, like I'm going to do in this case, to maybe 64, 65%. So it's not quite so dramatic. But what that has done is pulled all the focus back up to these guys. We could even use some of that mask. So remember, as long as I've got my paintbrush on, I'm still painting the same mask. I could darken this area up here a little bit. And just on the edges. Because especially when you're going to print, when you print, you don't really want things getting brighter towards the edge if you're trying to keep the audience's attention into here. So we want things dying off towards the edge in terms of lighting them out. I'm going to reduce that opacity down to 10 there. There, that looks pretty nice. Just pull that down there as well. Okay. With our background, I don't want to use our clarity slider on the whole background. The reason being, because when I do, let's go to the extreme. Yes, it will punch those guys a little bit, but it's also making these leaves really, really sharp out here and really, really defined. We're trying to, again, pull the focus back to these guys. So instead, you guessed it, new layer. And this layer we're going to call clarity on animals. And I'm going to put our clarity up to, I'm going to guess, about 30. And this is one of the cool things with layers. I can paint onto a layer and see the effect happen. So I can say on this area here, so just to prove the point, with this layer, imagine if I'd set to -4 stops in exposure. Now when I paint, it's not going to go to 4 stops because my opacity is only at 43%. Let's set it to 50. So if this was set to, let's make it exactly 4 stops, and my opacity is 50%, then guess what? I'm painting on effectively 2 stops worth of change. And as I paint, we've just increased their exposure where I painted by 4 stops. And I can do the same with clarity. So with our clarity paintbrush, I'm painting on clarity, onto their fur. So I'm not affecting the whole image, I'm just affecting the areas that I'm painting right now. Let's just pull up his face a little bit more there. So if I turn my mask on, we can see where I've painted. I can be pretty rough with it because it's not like it's 100% or 4 stops worth of difference. You're not going to see that. But let's just zoom in here. Let's go to 200%. In fact, let's keep it at 100 so you can see it properly. If I turn this off and turn it on, it's very, very subtle, but it's pulling out all these bits of fur. There is one other trick we can use on this. So remember as well, we've also got that structure tool. So clarity is a mid-tone adjustment. Structure is effectively finding edges. It's creating details in edges where it can find them. Now, fur is full of edges. Frankly, it's full of contrast points. If I pull that structure up too much, it's horrible. The reason it's horrible is because it's created all these halos around every single line, every single structure, or every single contrast point on there. But if I use it a little bit, maybe only 20 on that slider, where the fur is a little bit soft in our focus, rather than using sharpening, which may give us a over the top effect on everything here, and it's also going to introduce some noise that we don't want. Let's pull that back. By using structure, it's a lot more subtle, and we've targeted it only on the animal's fur. So what I haven't done is improved or increased the sharpness and clarity of anything else around here. It's all about them as a subject. Okay, overall, now I've done that, I might want to just pull up our warmth just a bit. Let's get a bit more warm light in there. Correct for that tint, that looks really nice. Okay, so here's our before. Nothing wrong with the shot, it's a nice shot, but here's our after, which feels more designed around them. Overall, what I'd say is we can probably afford to push our exposure up a touch. Now there, because we did bring back those highlights on their skin already. So before, after. And then going back to David's point around different crops. And now we've made that. You've seen me do this a few times, but I haven't really explained it too well. Capture One works on what's called variants. So we have our original file here, and I can do two things. I can create a new variant, and what a new variant will do is take away anything that I've done, including things like ratings. So I use these stars to work out which images we're going to edit. If I create a new variant, it's not going to show in this because I've filtered to only show me images with 1 star or higher. So if I create a new variant, it's going to disappear. The new variant didn't go anywhere. It has gone somewhere. It's just, it's hidden because I've got a filter on. There it is there. If I turn the filter on again, because the new variant doesn't have any properties that I've changed in Capture One, it is the original raw file. If I change our filter back to say, show me only things with 1 star, it's only going to show me the one that I had as 1 star and the one that I was editing that also had 1 star. To create a new version of this with all of the same properties that I already had, let's take this one, right click, go to clone variant. So clone variant is going to take all of the data in the original raw plus these adjustments and create a copy for me. So there's my clone. And I can order these in the browser as I want. So I can move these around into whatever order I want. So there's my original. There's the variant that I was working on just now. And now there's a clone of that variant. Now with the clone, I could reset all of those adjustments. So adjustments, or reset, or Command and R. Everything goes back to as if you'd never touched the image. But instead, what David's question was is, could we crop this to even more to make it more dramatic? A few options. So yes is the answer. There's a few options we could do. One way is actually we could make this a 1x2 rather than a 3x2, which would pull us up to maybe even there. So let's keep it on the 3rd line. Cool. We could even go 3x2, or we could, again, let's talk about the square options and so on. So I'm going to create a new variant, a clone, sorry. In my clone variant, let's go to our crop tool. Maybe we try this one square. No problem. Let's go to there. Okay, that's kind of cool. So now we've got 3 different versions of the same file and our original. All of them are independent. I can make changes to any single one of them. I can create a new clone from any of them. So from this clone, I can now create another clone. And so on this clone in particular, actually, I love the crop, but I might want to cool down our white balance. Well, we could do that too. So all these clones, effectively, you've still got the same original raw file, but these are all copies and variants with adjustments as you like them. Going back to what I originally said, you see this crop difference. So if I went from this crop to this crop, if I apply a vignette, and I'm happy with my vignette in this crop, looks pretty good. If I then apply this, so this is minus 2.36, apply the same vignette to this crop, and it's going to crop differently. Oh, sorry, it's going to vignette differently. And the reason it's vignetting differently is because of this setting here, elliptic on crop. So just be careful with some of the adjustments that you make. If you then make a crop change later, it's also going to change the adjustment, especially when it comes to vignetting. So depending on where we're at. But yeah, that vignette actually looks quite nice. That one doesn't look bad either. This one gives us a lot more options in terms of print, so if you ever wanted to put text and something on there, fine. But there's our original, and here are all of our options. When I send you guys back an EIP file, so those that have had images edited, I send you an EIP. That EIP is basically Capture One's container for any of these files that I've edited with all the different adjustments. So you'll get one EIP. When you load that into Capture One, it will actually load up all of these different versions of the same file, and you're then free to adjust them at will. Okay, let's look at one quickly from Peter. This one, so the question Peter sent in was about he'd done a black and white edit. What could we do? Two quick things on this. One is I want to lose those people. It's a bit complex because they're a reflection. And two, I want to sort of level it up a little bit. So first off, let's fix this leveling thing. And I've got a decision to make. If I try and use our straighten tool, yeah, it's okay. But we've got this bit here as well, which I'm not too sure on. So where I'm sort of coming from is, let's leave it at original output crop. Pull it down to there. In fact, we've got a little bit of room here, so we could go unconstrained. Let's just try this out to here. Okay. If I were to use our Keystone tool and use the horizontal keystone, because this is going away from us, you've got this parallax effect that we talked about before from top to bottom. We've also got this going away from us left to right. We could use our Keystone tool to follow this line of trees and even up that perspective. What that's done is it's helped get rid of some of this. What I could then do if I really wanted to, I don't know whether I need the whole of the reflection, that's what I'm debating in my head, or whether that's actually enough. This is now personal choice. So I could leave that reflection in. Yeah, this isn't too distracting here. Probably leave that as it is. But we've just evened up the shoreline. It now looks level. The problem with reflections is they need to be either vertical or not. You can't have really a reflection that's off at an angle. It doesn't make sense to our eyes. So this has to be completely level in order for this reflection to be vertical. These people down here, we've got a choice. We could use them for scale. A lot of people might choose to. We've got a little bit of purple fringing. I'm zoomed in at 300%, but let's pull off our defringing, get rid of that purple. That's much better. Okay. So let's start off with a heel layer. And I'm going to choose my source here. And I'm going to say I want to paint a healing layer in here. And let's see what a job it can do. That's pretty good. Now here's our problem, because they're reflected down the bottom as well. Let's just pull that to there. That's a bit better. Okay, so this reflection we got it rid of. I can't use the same vector because this angle is different, but what I can do is create another healing layer. And let's take our source from there and paint them here. Cool. So there's our people gone. That was easy. I want the sky to be a bit more rich in color and a bit deeper blue, really. So let's use our color editor for that. We'll come back to the white balance in a second. So I'm going to create a new layer. Let's do an empty layer. Sky, I'm going to do a couple of things with it. We're going to create a happy little gradient in there, just in case. And with our color editor down here, so this has picked up the blue. I'm going to pull up our saturation, not too much. Hold down the Option key to pull down our lightness. There we go. Now with that gradient, the reason I've done that gradient is because I want to affect this area here less than this area here. So I'm going to pull this area like this. So it's having less of a color effect in the editor on the left-hand side than it is over here. And also with the color editor on the cyan scale, I'm going to pull that lightness down there and shift the blue to be a bit more blue, and that's only affecting this area up in the top right. That's the dust spot there. Let's just fix that with the dust spot tool. Gone. Okay. to me, the white balance is a little bit off. It's not too far wrong, but I'm going to go back to our background layer. I'm just going to correct some of this green tint in this and just cool down a touch there. That looks a bit better. Okay, and then next, well, in fact, let's just do one final thing. I'm going to use clarity. But actually, I don't want to use clarity on everything. I don't want mountain halos and all that sort of stuff. So I'm going to create a new layer. And I call this tree, oops, tree clarity. And we're going to paint. Again, our brush, so because we're going to use the layers opacity, I can set my brush to 100%, no problem. And I'm just painting over these trees here. See the mask there, okay. I could, if I wanted to be really picky, I could either erase this area or I could cheat and say Luma range, I want to remove any of the areas which are snow or sky. It's quite a neat tool there. So I've now only done the trees and only done the area that I painted. And with that layer, let's now push up our clarity. There we go. Right, so without and with. And what that's done is it's just separated out all these lines of trees. So without and with. And we've got all this texture back in here, but we haven't affected the sky because remember that mask has got a Luma range applied to it that says only touch the stuff that's dark and fall off quite gradually and ignore the stuff that's bright. So in the histogram, ignore this big chunk here that we're not even touching, which includes the snow. Okay, so from a color image point of view, I'm quite happy with that. I wouldn't vignette it. It looks quite nice. It looks quite evenly exposed. We can, just like before, I'm going to create a clone of that variant. And with this variant, I could then, so I could apply a style if I wanted to. We can go into our black and white styles, sorry, presets. We can put on a black and white preset or preset if we want. Or, ooh, that's a bit wacky, we can use our black and white tool, just like we did in the previous session. So turn the black and white tool on. And then with this tool, we can actually use these sliders to tweak the areas that we want to affect. So I can make our trees stand out by, there's a little bit of red in those trees. We can see that red here. And it's all of this stuff, where it's probably autumn time or it's sand. So that's brightening those areas there in the photo. Let's pull down our yellows, pull down our greens. That gives the trees a bit of texture. With blues, well, that's our sky. So we can make the sky brighter in this black and white, or we can make it really dark and over the top and horrible. So there's somewhere in between that's probably the right mix, which is probably about there. That's cool. Magentas I'm not going to do much with because they're not going to do much other than that mountain on the right hand side. But in the black and white version, what I do need to do is to improve on some of our contrast because it's a bit washed out here. So I'm going to use overall in our background layer a touch of clarity. I am going to pull down some highlights, pull down some whites, pull up the shadows, push down the black slider. So that's pulling up the bottom, let's say third to a quarter, up towards the lighter end of the scale, and then taking the last 10% of my histogram and pushing that really, really down. That's giving us a lot more contrast. I could just use plain old contrast as well, just to really boost it. But that gives me a really nice black and white feel. And then the final thing I want to do is just add a new gradient, because in the black and white version, we've got this lighter area up here that doesn't make sense. So I'm just going to put a very, very, very soft gradient in up there. And with that gradient, I'm just going to pull down the sky to there. Cool. So let's go back to our original. Let's create a reset one. So there's our original. That would be my crop of the color version. And then that would be where I'd be at with the black and white. But again, because we've created all those clones, none of these are destructive. So we've still got the original raw. These are just adjustment sets that have been applied to the same image. Okay. Right, are there any questions on images before we move on? Hopefully not. There's about a 15-second delay, so I just need to fill this with lots of voice so that it doesn't sound like I've disappeared before any questions appear, because you've only just got the question now, I think. And other than ST saying magic, I think we're good. Okay. Cool. So, just to go back to the very beginning. So, that's today's session. Those are those images. We can pick up on some of the ones that we missed before on the next session. The next session, I think, let me try and remember, is I think on Tuesday next week. It's either Monday or Tuesday next week. That'll be on the website or on Facebook. just to confirm, remember, if you want to send images into this session, use the upload tool. So that's the way that you get raw files to us. It's also the way that we send back the EIP files so you can play with them. So that tool is live all the time. You can send it any time of day. We'll pick it up when we can and try and include it in the next one. The version of Capture One, remember, that we're using is 20.04. Make sure you're on that version. If you don't have Capture One, there are now 4 options for you to get it. Number 1, you can buy a pro version. You can get 25% off right now using that code. Number 2, if you've got an older version of Capture One, you can upgrade using the 30% off code that's on the screen there right now. Number 3, you can try it for free for 30 days using their trial. Or number 4, you can enter that competition, which is free and easy. And on the 15th of April, or in fact the 16th, you will find out whether you have won a copy of Capture One by answering a really simple question, which the answer is actually hidden on that page somewhere if you really look for it. Okay, cool. If there aren't any other questions, we're probably all good to go, and I will see you on the next session. All right, stay safe, stay home, those people that have told to stay home, and we'll catch you next week. Cheers, bye.